Iqbal takes his ideas from different sources. He takes it from Western philosophy, he takes it
Theory
from
of science, that is totally wrong. And his skepticism was not methodological, it was existential. And it is not because of Ghazali that we have this debacle in science or decline in science or irrationality.
Professor Sam Iqbal often highlights a disconnect in how we view the rational and the mystical. How did Iqbal view the relationship between a rational philosophical approach and Sufi experience?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to a very special episode. Today we are stepping into a profound philosophical arena to explore a fascinating intersection of minds. Allama Iqbal's brilliant critique of Imam Al-Ghazali. We are tracing a bridge built across 9 centuries, debating the very nature of human reason, faith, and the ego. To help us navigate this dense intellectual landscape, I am incredibly honored to be joined today by two of the finest minds in contemporary scholarship. First, we have Professor Hamid Naseem Rafiabadi Saheb. He is a towering academic figure, a prolific author, and an acclaimed authority on Islamic philosophy and classical theology. Professor Hamid Saheb's extensive research into the intellectual landscape of the 11th century and his deep, nuanced understanding of Ghazalian thought makes him the perfect guide to help us understand why Imam Al-Ghazali took the path of radical skepticism all those centuries ago. And then alongside him is Professor Mufti Mudassir Saheb. He's a brilliant scholar of literature, hermeneutics, and modern philosophy, widely celebrated for his sharp analytical lens and deep insights into Iqbalian thought. Professor Mufti Saheb specializes in modern philosophical transitions, making him uniquely equipped to unpack how Allama Iqbal attempted to reconstruct the modern Muslim mind by challenging the traditional status quo. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the podcast, where today we dive into a monumental intellectual crossroads, Allama Iqbal's profound critique of Imam Al-Ghazali. To unpack this historical philosophical tension, I am joined by two eminent scholars, Professor Hamid Naseem Rafiabadi Saheb and Professor Mufti Mudassir Saheb. Professor Hamid Naseem Rafiabadi, an acclaimed expert on Ghazalian thought, will guide us through the intricate depths of classical Islamic theology, while Professor Mufti Mudassir, he is having a PhD in English literature but well versed in Iqbalian thought, will guide us through the lanes of Allama Iqbal. We need to understand that Allama Iqbal's attitude towards Imam Al-Ghazali is one of the profound, respectful, coupled with a sharp foundational disagreement. The disagreement is in this case that Allama Iqbal and other Orientalists, even including a great astrophysicist, Neil deGrasse, they think that Imam Ghazali put a stagnation to Muslim intellect, and after that, no contribution in the fields of science, literature could happen because of Allama Al-Ghazali's thought. So, Professor Mufti, I will start with you. Let's begin with the context of the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. What was the specific intellectual and political crisis of the early 20th century that compelled Allama Iqbal to undertake this massive philosophical project? What was the modern world he was responding to? Was it the world of science which was peeping in philosophy and we can say art? Or what made Allama Iqbal to think and write this book?
Reconstruction of religious thought in Islam is of course a monumental contribution of Allama Iqbal, and he himself has something to say about why he wrote that book or why he delivered those lectures, which are then later on collected in the form of a book. So Iqbal says that there is a need to reinterpret Islam for the modern age.
For the modern age.
Yes, and he thinks that our classical understanding and classical interpretation of Islam is somehow inadequate to meet the challenges of the modern age, and he makes it very explicit that we need to reinterpret some of the fundamental things in our religion, and we need to make it accessible and understandable to a new generation who are acquainted with new knowledge which has come from Western science, Western philosophy. So he makes that very explicit, that this is what he is aiming to do. But as far as the intellectual background and the social and the political background of these lectures is concerned, that is very much an important part of understanding, of our attempt to understand these lectures. So I will talk about a few of those. He is writing in a very concrete context where Western dominance is now acknowledged by almost everybody. And Iqbal was himself trained in the West in philosophy and law, and he was also well grounded in Islamic sciences, in Islamic literature, especially languages. And his exposure in the West enabled him to look at the problem that Muslims were facing from an entirely new perspective, which was not generally available to most Muslims of India at that time, or even other parts of the Islamic world. So the background was provided by what we call secular modernity. That secular modernity that had actually it had become the most prominent feature of the Western civilization, because religion was in a way pushed to the background, and secularism had taken you could say it had taken the central place in almost all the fields of the Western civilization, their culture, their educational system, their entire outlook on life. So Iqbal saw secularism as a threat to civilization. Because he's a believer, he thinks that secularism is a deviation in the history of man's intellectual journey. Because secularism, in the sense, not in the sense of, because secularism is used in different senses, not in the sense that state and religion should be kept in two different zones or two different compartments, but secularism in the sense of the absence of religion, that religion has to play absolutely no role in the lives of people. In this sense, Iqbal thought that secularism was a threat and he tried to combat it. This is one thing. Another thing is that Iqbal saw that modern knowledge is posing a challenge to some of the fundamental ideas of religion. Religion is based on certain assumptions or certain arguments and a particular view of life. But modern knowledge, whether it comes from science, whether it comes from philosophy, whether it comes from social sciences, poses a threat to a religious outlook on life. And Iqbal thought that this has to be addressed, and this challenge has to be taken up, and it has to be answered. And along with this is another thing which is important, which is the intellectual, the political, the military superiority of the West. And as a result of which, the Eastern world, including the Islamic world, was down and under, as they say. The subjugation, the political subjugation of Muslims, it was not merely a political subjugation, it was also an intellectual subjugation. In the sense that Muslims in the early 20th century were well aware that they have nothing to show, in the sense that their contribution, whatever contribution they had made to the field of knowledge, it belonged to a bygone age, the classical, the golden age of Islam. But now for the last 300 years or even more, this was the age of the West. So Iqbal was keenly aware of all these challenges. And these things actually play a very important role in the content and in the methodology that Iqbal adopts in these lectures. He is trying to address the challenge of secular modernity. He is trying to address the challenge of modern knowledge, and he is not shying away, and he is not, being apologetic. Many people think that Iqbal is being apologetic in many places. Maybe there are a few places where he gives a concession here or there, but overall, we will see that Iqbal is not apologetic about Islam and the beliefs of Islam and the idea that he wants to defend. He thinks that the fundamental, you can say the intellectual, that core on which Islam rests can be rationally defended and rationally demonstrated. And that's why he writes this book. Very nice introduction. Professor Hamidullah Maraji Sahab, shifting back several centuries, we will simply jump to the time of Imam Al-Ghazali. He faced difficult but equally severe crisis of certainty. Could you paint the picture of the 11th century intellectual landscape? What challenges from the falsafa and the political instability of his time forced Ghazali into his deep intellectual struggle?
You are right that during the time of Ghazali, there was the domination of Greek philosophy. As in modern times, we have domination of Western philosophy, culture, education, everything. As Professor has rightly mentioned about that. So we find that Greek philosophy was that much dominant at that time that people like Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, they were considering themselves as the humble students of Aristotle.
And such was the influence of Greek philosophy.
A lot of domination, intellectual domination, and I should say philosophical landscape was such, which was shaped by Greek thought, a great extent. At the time, Ghazali just himself studied philosophy, and he took at least 2 years to ponder on that, and he wrote books on that, like Maqasid al-Philosopher, in which he tried to encompass the whole landscape of Greek philosophy and make it accessible to scholars to know it better, because it was very difficult otherwise. And after that, he wrote another book, Tahabt al-Philosophy. So, and then he wrote other books also, that is Ahad al-Madin. So in this way, a lot of domination from the Greek civilization and Greek philosophy was there. And it was impacting, it was influencing almost every aspect of Muslim life. And now people were starting objecting to the basic beliefs of Islam. And even Ghazali himself has mentioned about that. A scholar like, a philosopher like Ibn Sina would say, I don't need to go for prayers because I know what is the purpose of prayer.
What is the purpose of prayer?
So purpose is important, not the action. So in this way, and he just used to say many things which were sometimes contradicting Islam, and he just enumerated about 20 problems which in the view of Ghazali were going against Islam. And 3 of these were tantamount to the infidelity, like God's knowledge of the universals at the expense of particulars, and then the eternity of the world, and the resurrection of the souls and the bodies. So these were the 3 issues on which Ghazali thought that these are blasphemous beliefs of the philosophers based on the Greek philosophy. And then the political conditions were not also very good that time. There was a lot of turmoil going on, and sectarian divisions were just emerging every passing day. And at that time, Ghazali thought that we have to understand the Greek thought better than the Greek philosophers or their adherents are knowing. And then unless and until we master this philosophy, we should not rebut it. And then after understanding that philosophy and pondering on that for one complete year, he came out with very substantial, I should say, writings, as I mentioned about Maqazil philosopher, Tahawut philosopher, and then Al-Mudkis Nazala. And he tried to enumerate the arguments presented by these philosophers, which were going contradictory to Islamic ethos, Islamic belief system, and the cardinal beliefs of Islam, like concept of God, eternity of the world, and also the immortality of the soul, such type of things. So in this way, he was also facing the same situation in a sense as we have been facing, Iqbal was facing in a sense. Although conditions were different, but the challenge was very enormous. So Ghazali took up that challenge and he rebutted philosophers through their own coin. And it is because of that, isn't the scholars like Shubli Namani says, that Ghazali silenced philosophers in the East for 100 years.
For 100 years.
And they would have been silenced for all times to come had not Ibn Rushd appeared on the scene in the West, in the Cordoba. So in this way, Ghazali's role was very important, and he tried to understand the challenges of the times, which were intellectual in nature and most philosophical in nature. And there were also philosophical as well as political turmoil was also going on. And he tried to situate Islam in a different way. And then he tried to come out with the alternative in his book, Ayal al-Mudin, and gave which is considered to be Baqas the Sharia. He showed what are the purpose behind or objectives behind the Sharia, which have been mocked by philosophers sometimes. So in this way, Ghazali tried to come out with an alternative.
So very fine. Having set the stage, let us look at the intersection where these 2 minds collide regarding the methodology of finding the truth. I may once again go to Professor Mufti Mudassir. Professor Sahab, Iqbal writes in his first lecture that Ghazali resort to philosophical skepticism was a rather unsafe basis of religion. Why does Iqbal disagree with Ghazali here? Why did Iqbal believe that human reason is not an enemy of faith, but is instead inherently capable of touching the infinite? Was he simply trying to make science and other thoughts which were evolving at that time compatible with the Islamic traditional thought?
Before I answer this question, I want to say something about a fundamental belief in Iqbal. Iqbal's conviction was that time and change, they are the modes of reality.
Right.
And he was such a believer in, such a strong believer in change, and that he thought that all philosophies which somehow try to argue or prove that time is unreal are false philosophies. So he believed in the reality of time. The reality of time means that change and permanence are 2 sides of the same coin. And if I have to sum up Iqbal's project, I can say that Iqbal is trying to bring together the ideas of change and permanence, just like he's trying to bring together the Islamic and Western thought, just like he's trying to bring together religion and scientific enterprise. He's trying to argue fundamentally that change is such a reality that if today people who are trying to understand Islam, they somehow do not address the problem of change, they will end up not serving religion, but in fact they will end up causing a disservice to religion. So this is a fundamental thing that has to be kept in mind, that Iqbal was a serious believer in the phenomenon of change. That is why he talks about reconstruction and reinterpretation, meaning that the fundamentals of faith will remain the same, but many things about the faith will need a reinterpretation as per the demands of the changing times. So coming to Ghazali, Iqbal in the first lecture, of course, we must understand that Iqbal was a great admirer of Ghazali. But at the same time, he is also critical of him at some places. And one of the things that he criticizes in Ghazali is that in Ghazali, the domain of reason is severely restricted. So we can begin with saying this, that for Iqbal, the role of reason is much more or much greater than is allowed by Ghazali. And Iqbal is a firm believer in the capacity of reason to make many things possible for humans, to open vistas of knowledge for human beings. And he's convinced that, for example, at one place in Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, he goes to the extent of saying that the birth of Islam is the birth of inductive intellect. Such is the importance that Iqbal gives to reason. And he criticizes Ghazali precisely because Ghazali, unable to find the basis or the ground for certitude in reason, takes a step away from reason into the domain of mysticism, into the domain of pure intuition, which somehow suggests to Iqbal that he is trying to secure a domain for religious experience in exclusively the world of intuition or mysticism or Sufism, the world of feeling or the domain of feeling. Iqbal disagrees here. Iqbal says that reason and feeling, reason and intuition, they go together. In fact, he quotes Bergson, who has said that intuition is only a higher kind of intellect. So he does not believe that the two can be separated. To go into some kind of technicality, which Iqbal does when he talks about Ghazali, he says that thought and intuition are not mutually exclusive. And thought necessarily has to simulate finitude and inconclusiveness because it is tied to serial time, whereas intuition is not tied to serial time. And this is a bit technical, from a philosophical point of view. But the point is that Iqbal is saying that even thought has the capacity to apprehend ultimate reality. But because it is tied to serial time, so it has to simulate finitude and inconclusiveness. So this is a fundamental difference that Iqbal has with Ghazali's idea that only intuition or mystical experience can grant you some kind of surety, some kind of certitude about the truth of religion. There is another thing which is related to this one, which is that pure intuition, according to Iqbal, can never be a very safe refuge for faith. One, because this is something which is, and when Iqbal talks about religious experience, he thinks that religious experience reaches its culmination in the prophetic experience. But prophetic experience is such an experience that only the prophet is a unique person. The kind of experience that a prophet has is not given to everybody else, right? But then prophet is able to communicate the fruits of that experience to common people. Just like he says as in Javed Nama at one point, Mustafa andar hira khilwat guzid muddate juz khishtan kasra nadid nakshimara dar dile u rikhtan ummate az khilwatash angikhtan. That is, when the prophet used to meditate in Gar Hira, what happened during that meditation was that, and the design of the entire nation that he was going to found, it was poured into his heart. So an entire nation rose from his meditation. So Iqbal's point is that this unique experience of the prophet, then it did not remain confined to him. He was able to communicate the fruits of that to other people.
Even though it's very difficult for others to experience this.
Others people cannot have the same experience. So we are asking for too much if we expect everyone to have some kind of mystical experience and say that only then you will have a very sound basis for faith and religion. Common people will find different ways to experience religion. And of course, prayer is the experience where every common believer also experiences God. But the experience of prayer is, a prophetic experience is much richer, much higher experience than the experience of prayer or experience of a common man. So to say that mystical intuition is the only basis for religion is a bit problematic for Iqbal.
For Iqbal, right? We don't know what actually Iqbal meant with reason, because when we speak of scientific reason and logic, then all religions are at stake. We find that's altogether a different debate. Now, coming to Professor Hamid Naseem Rafiabadi. Professor Sahab, let's look at this time from the other side. Ghazali documented his intellectual crisis in Al-Munkar. How did Ghazali use skepticism as a tool? Why did he feel that relying purely on senses and discursive reason was a dead end for religious certainty?
There is a confusion that Ghazali was challenging reason. Because I have worked on Ghazali and almost I have seen his all important books which pertain to his epistemology and philosophy. He has never challenged reason. Rather, he has given 4 judges for judging different aspects of life. And he calls them as, for example, he calls Hakim His. First judge is the judge of self-perception. Many things are, believed on the basis of sensory knowledge. But there are several things which can't be discussed or understood by sense perception alone, because there are a lot of limitations to sense perception. And he gives the example of that we sometimes consider rope and snake during the night, and sometimes snake as rope, or we see the rod is tilted, the seam is tilted in the water, although it's not like that. And the heavenly body is like sun, seems very small, although it is bigger than our earth.
Much bigger.
So he just gives such type of examples, and he says sense deceive us many times. Then who will decide what is right and what is wrong? Then comes the judge of reason, Hakmi Aql. He calls them Hakmi Aql, and it decides many things. It is not like that, it's like this. Then there are several things which are not being judged by reason. Reason makes mistakes, and then comes the judge of intuition, Hakmi Wisdom. But there are several things which are not being understood or comprehended by Wisdom, intuition. Then comes the Hakmi Wahi, the judge of the revelation, which is the ultimate source of knowledge. But problem with Iqbal is, because we are critically analyzing Iqbal and Ghazali.
Yes.
With Iqbal is that Iqbal could not understand that what is the difference between mystical experience and prophetic experience. Although he has talked sometimes about Abdul Haq Gangohi, that he said Prophet Sallallahu has gone to the Miraj. Had I gone there, I would have not come back. And Iqbal just interprets that there is difference between the intuition of Sufi and the Prophet. And the intuition of the Prophet is, that he comes back from that state and he guides people afterwards. But Sufi remains there while he is in that state. But the problem is that there is a lot of difference between the intuition of a Sufi and a Prophet. Prophets don't have all intuition, they have revelation, which comes from external sources. Intuition is internal. And when Iqbal says that it was wrong on the part of Ghazali, that he could not understand that reason becomes, intuition. It is elevated to intuition. It was wrong. Ghazali has made difference between intuition and reason. He gives reason its status. For example, in many of his books, he says how I can challenge reason when Allah has praised it. The example of reason is like eye, and the example of Sharia is like sun. If we don't have eye, we can't have vision of the sun. And he never challenges reason, but he says there are limitations to reason, human reason. It is same as Bertrand Russell in his book, Human Knowledge, Scope and Limits. He has also shown the limits of reason. So, and even Kant has also shown the limits of reason. So people just to call that Ghazali was against reason, he was against science. I have written a complete article which was published in Hamid Islamicus, where I have shown that these all notions which have been separated by some Orientalists and others, they are influenced by some Muslim scholars as well. That they just won't call Ghazali responsible for the decadence of scientific spirit in Muslims, or rational spirit in Muslims. And I have demolished that thesis at all. And there are many books which have been written on the subject. People have just said that this is not true also. And from the books of Ghazali, there were other reasons why Muslims why decline in science took place. One of that was sack of Baghdad. And then there are other some internal
not because of Ghazali.
Not because of Ghazali. And Ghazali has praised science like anything. He calls it, it is farz kifaya. Some people have to go for science. And if we not do for the cutting, he calls about that and other sciences. He at one point says in this why all people are going for studying jurisprudence, fiqh, why they don't go for studying medicine.
That's science.
Then he just mocks at those people. He says, if we ask these muftis or these jurists that why you are not going for the tib, when you are saying that we cannot have the evidence of a non-Muslim for ascertaining something, but you are going to those non-Muslim physicians to get treated, but you don't accept their witness. So there should be some Muslims who should go for studying their medicine. And without that, there is no possibility of living in this world. And we need cutting, we need other type of medical science as well. In this way, if we say that Iqbal has done justice with the Ghazali, I do believe so. Iqbal has been very much praiseworthy about Ghazali. Also, he says that as he says, falsafa reh gaya talqeen Ghazali reh gayi rasme azaz bure bilali. He says that Ghazali was giving talqeen. He was giving instruction, and we are missing that in our philosophy modern times. But when he talks in the Reconstruction of Religious Thought, when he talks about Ghazali, I feel that Iqbal could not understand what basically Ghazali wanted to say about intuition. According to Ghazali and most of Islamic scholars and mystics, intuition is a separate source of knowledge. It can't be, it is not the elevation of reason. It is something which is coming from above. It has also some divine sanctity. In many ways, as Ghazali says, Kana ma kana mimma last azkur. Faznanil khair wala tahsanil khabar. It was what it was, I don't know what it was. Have a good opinion, don't ask about details. It is something such we can't define it. We can't articulate it. So it has some different source. And for that reason, there are different type of intuitions. Sufis have one type of intuition. Scholars have another type of intuition. And other mystics have their own intuition. In order to just say that intuitions are only of one kind, and it's the elevation of reason, I think Iqbal wants that Ghazali should have talked about that. It was wrong on the part of Ghazali that he could not understand that intuition is the elevation of reason. But I say that Ghazali was right because he has defined intuition in different terms rather than as has been discussed by modern scholars. Because as my teacher Professor Taqiyami would say, all the people who are busy in some science, they get intuitions. Scientists get intuitions, philosophers get, poets get, and Ghazali has also talked about that. So in this way, the Ghazali was talking about that intuition which pertains to the religious matters, which does not pertain to the rational matters, philosophical matters. So in this way, to categorize it as a general intuition was wrong on the part of Iqbal, and then calling Ghazali that he could not understand that intuition is the elevation of reason, that was not justified in many ways, because Ghazali had his own reasons for defining intuition in a different way, not as it be defined by modern philosophers, or it has been defined by Ghazali even, or some other scholars. And secondly, Ghazali's skepticism was not methodological, it was existential. It was not like the methodology of doubt of Descartes, cogito ergo sum. It was natural, it happened to him, because he was thinking about many aspects of life. Why, as Prophet said that every newborn is born on the fitra. Then what about those people who are not Muslims? He was thinking on these issues, and finally he just was affected by this thinking and contemplation. Then he left the world for 10 years, and he went to many places, he wandered here and there. Sometimes he was in Hebron, sometimes in Makkah, sometimes in other places. So because he was affected by this existential doubt, it was not methodological doubt. So, but then it was cured. Later on, you'll be surprised to know, as has been mentioned by scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, he resorted to study the hadith. He said philosophy is not the mainstay for religious proving religion. Then he said it's the hadith. It is the revelation of Allah or Prophet's teachings, which can give us some strong hold for accepting the religion. So in this way, to doubt Ghazali that he was against reason or he was against science, that is totally wrong. And his skepticism was not methodological, it was existential. And it is not because of Ghazali that we have this debacle in science or decline in science or irrationality. There were other reasons for that. Ghazali has given different connotations and denotations of where reason can help us, where it can't help us, as was done by other philosophers. In the same way, he has defined intuition in a different way, which is not being defined in modern terminology. Even Iqbal could not do justice with Ghazali when he said that it is not the elevation of reason.
So very nice to listen to the perspectives of these two scholars. I will come back to Professor Mufti Mudassir. Professor Sahab, Iqbal often highlights a disconnect in how we view the rational and the mystical. How did Iqbal view the relationship between a rational philosophical approach and Sufi experience? How does he argue that thought and intuition are organically related rather than being separate compartments?
Well, when you look at Iqbal and you place him in the intellectual context to which he actually belongs, one thing that some people have said about Iqbal is that he does not have any original ideas. But I think that Iqbal is what he should have been, what he needed to be, and what Islam actually needed at that time, which is that we needed a great synthesizer at that point in time, in the beginning of the 20th century, one who would bring together different strands of intellect from different sources and somehow bring them together and synthesize them. So Iqbal takes his ideas from different sources. He takes it from Western philosophy, he takes it from the Islamic tradition, and his the single principle that actually guides him in this process is that he wants to maintain his connection with the tradition, but at the same time he wants to open the current to different influences. So he's not shutting out any influence from any quarter that it might make it itself available. This is one thing. Another thing is that when we talk about Ghazali and Iqbal's criticism of Ghazali, we now know, we are speaking in 2026, that even Orientalists have dismissed this thesis that somehow Ghazali should be thought as responsible for decline in Muslim intellect. Because Ghazali very clearly does not oppose sciences, although he does oppose philosophy, especially the kind of philosophy that was predominant in his time. But you can call it part of his being situated in his particular context, which every thinker is necessarily, and no thinker can actually completely get rid of the influences that are part of that context. Which is to say that although Ghazali criticizes the Greek influences, but he himself is so heavily indebted to those Greek influences. If you can read some of the recent work on Ghazali, you will know how much he is still indebted to Ibn Sina, his main adversary in philosophical thinking. And perhaps Iqbal was aware of the fact that when Ghazali talks of Tawheed, he somehow vacillates between two concepts of Tawheed. Where one, which is the traditional understanding that only God is the single entity, single deity to be worshipped and to be adored and to be obeyed, and another is what is called monism, which comes very close to the idea of unity of being. And in fact, when Ghazali talks about the unity of being in one or the other sense in his works, he does refer to, for example, when he talks about that verse, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard, he does refer to that idea of immanence, which brings him very close to the idea of unity of being or monism. Anyway, this is one thing. Another thing is that when you talk about Iqbal's idea about the role of reason and the role of intuition, as Professor Saab has rightly said, that we can see Iqbal perhaps is very close to Ghazali and other thinkers who are already convinced that intuition starts where reason ends, in a way, because reason does not have access to all the truths that are then made available to intuition, or as Iqbal would himself call it ishq. And so one is what Iqbal actually argues in his thesis, and how he tries to understand or encompass the problem, and how he tries to approach it, and how he tries to demonstrate some argument. Another is when it comes to the practical application of these ideas, can we actually see where reason operates and where it stops and where ishq starts? That's very difficult. So I would say that from a philosophical point of view, Iqbal thinks that reason will have a very important role in order to demonstrate the truth of religion, and therefore he is critical of all those mystics, and including Ghazali, who somehow do not give reason its due place in the matters of faith. He would stick to that, but then he would perhaps be much closer to Ghazali and other mystics in believing that if you want the real apprehension and the full apprehension of reality, then you have to step out of the domain of reason and you have to enter into the realm of ishq. In fact, Iqbal spends a lot of time in his poetry glorifying ishq and showing its superiority to aql, to khird. Sipah tazh bar angezam az vilayat ishq kidar haram khatare az bagawat khiradas. That I have raised a new army, for the army of love, because I saw that in Haram, in Holy Kaaba, there was a threat because of the resurgence of reason which is bereft of the divine guiding light of revelation. That was Iqbal's point. So perhaps Iqbal is closer to Ghazali and other mystics and other people who have stressed the idea of love in ishq than is generally understood.
Thank you very much. Once again, I will come to Professor Hamid Naseem Rafiabadi. Professor Saab, in Western academic circles and some modern narratives, Ghazali is often labeled as the enemy of philosophy and reason, who allegedly ended golden age of Islamic rational thought. How true is this claim, or how true is this charge?
Before addressing your question, I would like to subscribe also what compliment even what Professor Mudassir said about Ghazali. It was said that Ghazali was diseased by the Kitab al-Shifa of Ibn Sina. When you are contradicting or you are condemning or criticizing any philosophy, you are influenced also by that, and this is the way of intellectual growth. Ghazali could not discard the influence of the philosophy he was studying, and there are many people who have said about that Ghazali was also influenced by that. There's no doubt in that. But the point is, in my book which I have discussed, Muslim philosophy before and after Ghazali. But the philosophy which came after Ghazali, that had a different turn. That was Islamized to a great extent. And when I talk about Islamized philosophy, it starts from Ghazali. Because he criticized that philosophy on the basis of his own criterion, which was based on Islamic tenets. So in this way, although he was influenced by the Greek philosophy, no doubt in that, he got some arguments from them, but he had his own methodology to evaluate. But that was a rational methodology. How he could contradict philosophers if he had no reason? He had a rational explanation. And he did not come with religious arguments against philosophers. He comes with the rational arguments against the arguments of the philosophers. This type of the philosopher. Hardly he uses the Quranic terminology or these other things. He contradicts his reason with reason, and that is philosophy. And it was also a philosophy. It was not theology in that sense. And I sometimes say, as Professor Sayyid Wahiduddin would say, he was philosophically scholastic, not scholastically philosopher. He was a philosopher first, then he was scholastic. He was not only mutaqallim, he was philosophy as well. Because philosophy is free, rational, understanding of things, and logically reaching to some conclusions based on strong, premises. And Ghazali did that, and it was for that reason philosophers were very much worried how to rebut him. And people like Ibn Rushd, he had to write a book, Tahaf to Tahaf. and it took a lot of time to him to. But according to Magdalord, Ibn Rushd seems beggarly compiler before Ghazali. Beggarly compiler. Magdalord says. But what you said about this is very unfortunate. And I had a great discussion with people like Professor Muhammad Rafiabadi. He was the vice chancellor of our university, JNU, when I was studying there. They were saying that Arbery and others have said Ghazali was the executioner in chief of reason in Islam. I said, you are wrong, sir. Although they were my teachers, I have worked on Ghazali. So I have found that Ghazali has never opposed science or reason. But he wants to show what are the limits of each and every subject, because he was more interested in epistemology. What are the epistemological limits of reason? What are the epistemological limits of sense perception? And what are the epistemological, limitations of intuition? He says intuition also is, and he says where the vilayat ends, prophethood starts.
Prophethood starts.
Nubuwwat starts. Sufis are at the feet of prophets. They're at the feet of prophets. So he makes a differentiation between these different type of epistemologies, which have been adopted by different sections, seekers of truth. He calls them seekers of truth. He talks about naturalists, philosophers, Sufis, and finally he reaches to the revelation. That revelation is the only source which can guide us properly. And it is said that when Ghazali died, Bukhari was on his chest. Matul Ghazali wa ala sadri al-Bukhari. This has become a very famous quotation later on. So far as this that he was opposed to science or he was opposed to reason, as I said already, it is totally wrong. We have to understand the times of Ghazali. There were a lot of challenges. He wanted to save God religion, and he wanted to give it a such type of interpretation which would satisfy philosophers as well as common people. Because he was considered to be the Hujjatul Islam, the convincing proof of Islam. And he was given this title by people. And about 3,000 books have been written so far on Ghazali. And he just gave such interpretation of Islam which was very well balanced. He was the first person who aligned philosophy with theology. Before Ghazali, people were not talking about philosophy at all. He was the first person who aligned philosophy with Sufism. So in this way, he brought, in a sense, philosophy in the main domain of all these Islamic, seekers of truth. Even now after Ghazali, even Sufis had to just deal with philosophical interpretation of, Sufism. Otherwise, they were not relying on philosophy at all. And in the same way, theologians had to rely on philosophy. And philosophy became the very important subject after Ghazali, because he translated, he just interpreted Greek philosophy in such a way, and that became the part of the syllabi in Muslim university and the West as well. His book, that is Maqasid al-Philosopher, that was being taught in the Western universities and colleges as the textbook. It was known as Metaphysics of Ghazali. Although it was not his philosophy, he was just trying to show what is the metaphysics of the Greek philosophers based on the views of their interpreters among Muslims, Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi. So in this way, it is totally wrong that Ghazali was against science or he was against philosophy. He has advocated philosophy. He says philosophy is consisting of 6 subjects. One subject is physics, and we have nothing to do with physics. Physics is already true. And he says that people who are opposing mathematics, they are opponents of Islam. They are giving the opponents of Islam chance to say that Islam is against reason. Discredit Islam. But he says we have all the problem with metaphysics. Because metaphysics is based on speculations. It is not based on any scientific proof in that way. So far ethics is concerned, he says the Sufis, these philosophers have taken this, ethics from prophets. And politics has been taken from the Sufis. He says in his Al-Nazala, in this way he does not oppose philosophy as such. He categorizes, classifies which philosophy is to be accepted, because philosophy does not consist only on one subject, metaphysics. He says metaphysics has become the hotbed of atheism. Other subjects are not to be criticized. It may be it physics, maybe it ethics, maybe it politics, and these are totally beyond criticism. But there's only one subject which we are about to criticize, that is metaphysics, because on the basis of this, people are challenging the basic Islamic doctrines, whereas they don't have any sound ground for challenging these things. These are speculations, because metaphysics is not based on any scientific evaluation or verification. These are the speculations of the philosophers, and they have taken it from people. So we can challenge this, and only he has challenged it, the metaphysics of the philosophers. He has not challenged their scientific views or mathematics or physics. Rather, he has opposed those people who are challenging mathematics or who are challenging. And then he quotes once, when at the time of the Prophet, during the period of Prophet, there was a solar eclipse. And on the same day, son of Prophet had also expired, Ibrahim. Then people started saying that it is because of the death of the son of the Prophet, this eclipse has occurred. Prophet said, sun and moon are the signs of Allah. These have nothing to do with anyone's death or birth. So this was the scientific approach of Ghazali. He never allowed that science should be discarded based on some views or speculation of people. So in this way, we need to situate Ghazali as the Professor has said. Now there are many orationists. Even Musa Ibrahim, others, they have worked on this. They have written books also, several books on the subject. Other people also, they have said that it was totally wrong to attribute the decline of science to the philosophy of Ghazali. But we need to understand Ghazali in proper perspective. Ghazali gave a new direction, orientation to philosophy, and after Ghazali, we find even Sufis. They are presenting philosophical arguments for their theories. And like, Ibn Arabi and others. And in this way, we never can claim that Ghazali was responsible for the decline of science or his.
Thank you very much. To wrap up this incredible dialogue, let's evaluate the ultimate monuments these two giants left behind. To Professor Mufti Mudassir Sahab, I would like to ask you, looking back at this entire project, what do you consider to be Allama Iqbal's crowning achievement as a philosopher for the modern Muslim mind?
There are many things that Iqbal has contributed, and just a few, one or two that we can talk of here, is that his single most important contribution is his concept of Khudi. That is his original contribution. And it is here that we find that uniqueness of Iqbal. Because this word Khudi, he did not coin this word, it was already there. But this word had a very pejorative meaning before Iqbal. It was mostly used in the Sufi context for some, in the sense of ego, which one needs to suppress or which one needs to get rid of. And Iqbal is, I think, the first philosopher, thinker who actually invests this word Khudi with a positive meaning. And he also gives it a new interpretation. There he actually marks a very radical departure from the established understanding in Sufism. The entire focus of Sufism was on the negation of the self or the annihilation of the self. But Iqbal gives it a new interpretation. He says that self is not something to be negated. It is not something to be suppressed. It is not something to be
crushed,
to be got rid of. It is something to be strengthened. And the way he reads the Islamic scriptures, the Quran, for example, when he talks about the vicegerency of Adam, and he talks of why God reposed his trust in man, and what is now the responsibility of man. He says this impulse in Sufism of negating or annihilating the self as something which is at heart antithetical to the spirit of Islam. So he, with full vigor and full force, argues that self is to be protected, Khudi is to be protected, but we can do so only when we understand the real meaning of Khudi. It is not to be understood in terms of some kind of self-assertion or pride or arrogance. It is a pearl that God, in fact, this is rooted in his concept of the divine and of the relationship between the divine and the mankind. Because for Iqbal, the divine is the ultimate ego. But it is such an ego that it does not annihilate or crush other egos. Other ego, that is the human egos, also find place in that ego, in that divine ego. In fact, in Iqbal's scheme of things, the entire universe can be seen as a form of Khudi. All particles are, in some sense, in various gradations or levels of Khudi, at various levels of Khudi. But man enjoys a special place here because it is like God has shared this Khudi, which actually in the real sense only belongs to him. He has shared this Khudi with humans. That is why humans are made special. And that is how Iqbal reads the story of Adam, that God created Adam and made him special. And God gave him the trust of personality. Inna arzna al-amanata ala samawati wal ardi wal jibali fa abayna an yahmilnaha. This is how Iqbal interprets this verse, that we offered the trust of personality to skies, to earth, to mountains, but they all were afraid and nobody took it. وَحَمَلَهَا الْإِنسَانِ. But man took it. And Iqbal says that man took this trust of personality and it was not a small thing to take. And therefore, this Khudi is to be strengthened. And how will this Khudi be strengthened? This can be strengthened only when we understand our true relation with God. That is what actually sets off Iqbal's idea of man from atheism, where people like Nietzsche and others would say that man can become man only when he denies everybody else, including God. Iqbal says that no, man has to acknowledge God and man has to come near to God. Only then will man become man in the real sense. So this is one thing that actually is Iqbal's contribution. And secondly, and this is further in one of his beautiful verses where he says that man should be seen as God seeks man's cooperation in making the world a better place to live. Now see, he is in a way revising the philosophy that was with us for so long, because man was seen as a dependent candidate for salvation in the hereafter.
Exactly.
We have come here and we have to live this life, and we are meant to achieve some kind of salvation in the hereafter. Iqbal says that no, God is seeking man's help, and there is a beautiful verse in which he puts it. He says that Magar ba'iz ambazast Adam jahan pura u sakht in khub tar jahan u afreed in khub tar sakht. That is, God created the universe, man made it better. Magar ba'iz ambazast Adam. One can say that man is God's partner. in this, in making the world a better place to live. So man is not merely a candidate for salvation in the hereafter. Man has to show to God that his decision of reposing trust in him has not gone wrong. And it is man's duty now to prove God right. This is clearly said by Iqbal. This is one thing. Another thing is that Iqbal wants religion to be as long as, because religion is something that for Iqbal is the most important thing about human existence. Without religion, man is like an animal. But he is firmly convinced that if we do not make religion understandable and acceptable to people of all ages, to people of all types of intellect, then religion will lose its relevance. That is why Iqbal's fundamental contribution, according to me, is to show the correct, to demonstrate the correct relationship between permanence and change. Not all, why does he say kushtae, sultani, mullai, piri? He identifies three killers, three slayers of Muslims. One he calls sultani, which is kings, that is colonialism or monarchy, whatever you call it. Another is mullai, that is the supremacy of the religious class. And another is piri, which is the supremacy of the peers, of the Sufis. He says that we have been slain by these three, and we somehow need to recognize our position, and we can do only when we understand that we have a role which is much higher than we are told by these.
Right. At last, I will come once again back to Professor Hamid Naseem Rafiabadi. Professor Sahab, looking across the centuries to the present day, what remains Imam Ghazali's ultimate achievement and which lasting legacy as a philosopher and protector of the faith?
Ghazali just gave a religion what was given to be religion and what was to be given to philosophy and Sufism and everything. So a balanced approach to all these domains of knowledge and action. That was very important. He did not do injustice to philosophy or Sufism or religion. In this way, because we can't deny, philosophy has a role. Philosophers were there. He could not just take them for granted. He understood their philosophy fully and comprehended that, then analyzed that in his books, then critiqued it. Secondly, he saw the Sufis, and he thought that these are very important for us. This is also a domain of knowledge which is coming to us from the Sufism. And then he also worked on that and wrote many things on that subject, especially other books as well, Maqash for the Qulub. And then about other seekers of knowledge, he gives them also their importance. But he says that when we take them together, then we are able to resurvive. No group among them is complete in his or their knowledge. They have limitations. And he showed the limitations of those all. Then finally he thought that there is only one source of knowledge which is supreme to all, that is revelation. And we have to just anchor everything to it. Finally we have to just see reason, we have to see sense perception, intuition, but it has to be subservient to the revelation, because that is flawless. In philosophy there are shortcomings, in intuition there are shortcomings, in the sense perception there are, but there is only one source of knowledge which is complete, which is perfect, and which is unadulterated, that is only revelation. But he said that it is not only to just believe in the revelation, I said, but we have to also undergo, that is tazkiyah nafs. And then he laid much emphasis on moral training and mortification of the ego. And in this way we can see that Ghazali was understanding his times, and he prophesied what will be the challenges ahead. And for that reason he has remained relevant till date. People are still working on him, not only in the East but in the West. And people like Montgomery Ward, he says even the Christians cannot find a sympathetic guide like Ghazali.
Even Christians.
And there is one, Hawa Lazarus. She was a Jewish lady. She has the book study of Ghazali. Whole of her life she has just devoted to the study of Ghazali. She wrote a book, The Study of Ghazali. She says Ghazali is even guide to the Jews, because it has been said in Arabic, Al-Fazl ma shahidat bil ada. Greatness is that which is being acknowledged by the enemies. Even the people, Muslims, they have been adored. But I say, as has been said by Shibli Namani, in the West, Ghazali is famous for his philosophy, but in the East, only for his mysticism. We have not understood his philosophy. Otherwise, his philosophy is very deep in many ways, which is just like the philosophy of Saint Augustine, and like Aquinas and others, which have been, much work has been done by the Western scholars on their philosophers, but Muslims have been little bit, they have been afraid of his philosophical thought. Otherwise, it could just, provide balance in our that, and I should say that mystical tendencies only, we are just thinking mystical tendencies, not rationally. Had we imbibed Ghazali's thought in toto, because some people have taken Ibn Rushd, that is West, they have taken science, and we have taken only mysticism from Ghazali. If we combine these, and I say, we have to combine Ghazali with Ibn Rushd, with Iqbal, then all these three important scholars of Islamic world, they have come with solutions. For example, Iqbal, when he talks about the ijtihad, much work has been not done on that. This is a practical issue, and it is something which is more than what others have done. Iqbal was realizing as we are doing reconstruction of religious thought, we need to also have reconstruction of legal thought. And he wanted to bring, Al-Bashar Kashmiri in order to ask questions and provide, get replies from him to the questions which are emerging, legal questions, legal problems. So in this way, I feel that these all, philosophers which are influenced by Ghazali. Iqbal is influenced by Ghazali. Ibn Rushd was influenced by Ghazali, as Ghazali was influenced by the Greek philosophy. Because when you study some philosophy, you are, directly and indirectly influenced by that. And then it is the marriage of the thought, even Ibn Khaldun. And if we take them together, then we find that Ghazali has relevance in modern times. And we can balance the negative influence of Ghazali when we take other philosophers along with him. Because no one philosopher is complete in this way. They all together are providing us a holistic picture of reality of Islam. And now new scholars have also emerged, if we take them also along with them. And I will quote one of the scholars, he says, had a scholar like Shahullah Delhi emerged in the West, it would have become a movement. But we remain at the cult to worship. We don't go beyond one person or second person, third. We need to make their thought as a movement and criticize it. Whatever is good in that, whatever is relevant, we can accept that, whatever is not. Because we should not have cult worship belief. We have to see what is good in Iqbal, what is good in Ghazali, what is good in Ibn Rushd, and then see it in the light of the Quran, best from Quran and Sunnah. And then we can come out with some alternative to modern philosophies and provide some new guidance to new generations. Because we can't depend on only Iqbal for all times to come, or as Professor Saheb has rightly said, change. Change is one of the very important, points which Iqbal has emphasized. And he said, you should keep eye on the development of thought. Possibly better thought comes, with the passage of time. So if we just take in that sense, whether Ghazali, whether Iqbal, whether Ibn Rushd, whether Ibn Khaldun or other philosophers, then we are able to do justice with all of them and come out with, some new insights which have been influenced by all of those, and just abstracting the negative aspects, because they were also humans, they had limitations, and the conditioning of their times was also very important. What was relevant those days that may be not relevant today. There are several things which are not relevant now, because now philosophy is not that dominant. Now, as Al-Bashar Kashmiri would say, science has become more important than philosophy in modern times. We have to also see the importance of science in modern times. Muslims need to, go for scientific, developments and endeavors. So in this way, if we take those all together and then just build something new on the basis of their thought, and not stuck there, then I feel that Ghazali is still relevant, as Iqbal is relevant. Despite our critique, their importance cannot be, I should say, challenged. We have to accept their role they have played in their own times, and still their ideas and their thoughts are very much relevant to us. But we have to, see what is more relevant to our times in their thought, and what we have to add to that thought. And this has just become a moment, not a cult worship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And at the end, I would like to thank you both, the scholars, Professor Naseem Rafiabadi and Professor Mufti Mudassir, for their right ideas and narratives. Thank you very much.